What is going on, everybody? This is Alex Fergnani, and I welcome you to another episode of the Foresight Chats series. In this episode of the series, I had the honor to speak with one of the leading experts in longevity science globally, and by the way, also one of the few intellectual heroes who indirectly inspired me to go into the field of foresight more than a decade ago. Today, I'm talking with Aubrey de Grey. Dr. Aubrey de Grey is a biomedical gerontologist based in Silicon Valley. He's also the founder, president, and chief science officer at the HELIV Foundation, a biomedical research and advocacy charity focused on repairing the molecular and cellular damage of aging. Aubrey is also a highly sought-after speaker who gives frequent invited talks at scientific conferences, universities, and companies in areas ranging from pharma to life insurance. In this conversation with Aubrey, we talk about the details of ending aging in humans, what conditions of old age would likely be done away with, the kind of treatments that would likely be available, the anticipation of living longer that people may likely start to experience in just a few years from now, and how that would change our society. In the course of the conversation, I also try to convince Aubrey of the effectiveness of the use of scenario planning applied to the futures of longevity. And finally, we also touch upon lifestyle recommendations to extend our lifespan. So, I hope you will enjoy the conversation. Aubrey, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I have to confess that this is a real pleasure because you were one of my first influencers, so to speak. I think a decade ago, I read your book, Ending Aging, just a bit after it came out. And you were one of the very few people who influenced me to get into futurism and then into foresight. And then I took my master's degree in foresight, a Ph.D. in foresight. So now after a decade of experience, it's really a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, you're very kind. I'm delighted that I was able to help.
So I think the audience has an idea. They have an idea of what you've been doing. So we could take the bull by its horns, so to speak, and start talking about the past few things you have been doing with your new foundation, the LEV Foundation. And that maybe is a way for us to talk more deeply into the futures of longevity. So how about we start with the LEV Foundation. LEV stands for Longevity Escape Velocity, which is one of the major pursuits of the foundation, which speaks a lot of your goals. So how about we just introduce this idea, this concept of longevity escape velocity, which is one of the things you guys are trying to accomplish at the foundation as a way to talk deeper into the futures of longevity.
Sure. So longevity escape velocity is a concept that I first coined nearly 20 years ago now. And what it's all about is the point where we are winning the battle against aging. So what does winning mean? It means repairing the body faster than the body is damaging itself. Now, what does that mean? I mean, what does damaging the body damaging itself mean? What it really simply means is that the body is just like any other simple man-made machine. It damages itself as an inevitable consequence of its normal operation. Any machine, or at least any machine that has moving parts, has that feature.
Right.
And the human body is no different. Now, medicine is all about doing something about anything that's wrong with the body. That really means repairing damage that's in the body. And it, medicine against aging is all about repairing that particular type of damage, the damage that the body does to itself um, when it's in the course of its normal operation. So it turns out that the body does a lot of different types of damage to itself because it's a really complicated machine. But they are still slowly accumulating, so in principle we could fix them all.
Okay.
And the work that I've been doing over the past 25 years or so has been all about figuring out how to fix those types of damage, how to repair them, and thereby keep them under control. Under control means keeping them below a kind of threshold level. Because like any simple machine, like a car or whatever, the human body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of this damage without any significant impairment of function. And that's why we don't really go downhill very much until middle age. Why, people who are in their 40s or 50s can function both physically and mentally pretty much as well as they could when they were in their 20s or 30s, right? Okay, so longevity escape velocity is defined in terms of the therapies, the damage repair interventions, the medicines that we do. We need to develop medicines that can fix the damage that kills us, that makes us sick and eventually kills us. And as time goes on, we have to fix more and more types of damage. First we fix the ones that kill us now, and then we fix the ones that kill us when we're 20 years older or 40 years older or whatever, and so on. And they become progressively harder to fix because, kind of by definition, right?
And they compound as well.
They compound when we don't fix them.
Right.
But that's not really the same question. That's another
Okay,
part of
okay.
it. Anyway, the point is, so I define this term longevity escape velocity as the minimum rate at which scientists like me would have to keep improving the therapies in order to stay one step ahead of the problem, in order that people who were getting these therapies and getting the state-of-the-art therapies all the time would just not get biologically any older as time goes on, even though obviously they are getting chronologically older. In other words, the amount of damage in their bodies would not be increasing. And yeah, so as you mentioned early on, I coined this term nearly 20 years ago, and it's become kind of synonymous with my work because I've been all about damage repair. That's really the main thing that I guess I'm known for, is to get people to understand that repairing damage may be easier than slowing down the rate at which the body makes this damage in the first place. That was a very counterintuitive concept 20 years ago. It's now broadly accepted. And so, I realized that the better we get at repairing damage, the more we, if you like, buy time to get better still. And that's what longevity escape velocity is all about.
All right. Thanks for the clear introduction. So just as a matter of starting off looking into the future, when can we reasonably achieve longevity escape velocity based on your past research? This is a question that everybody has asked you. We just have to go through this. Apologies for asking this again.
You don't need to apologize. It's the right question.
Yes.
And I have been very disappointed by the reluctance of my colleagues to make these kinds of time frame predictions, even for other, milestones that we might have in the future. I believe that we can't make such predictions with any kind of confidence because, let's face it, we're talking about really pioneering technology. But we still have a duty as experts to give some kind of prediction probabilistically.
A range for us to think about it.
A range or a 50-50, whatever.
Okay.
So I normally focus on 50-50. I say, how soon do we have a 50-50 chance of reaching such and such a particular milestone? And the milestone that interests me the most, of course, is longevity escape velocity, because when we get there, we're never going to fall below longevity escape velocity again. It's not actually as obvious as all that, but I'm very sure it's true. In fact, a friend of mine, coined the term the Methuselarity, which is
Yes.
the at which we reach I didn't invent that term, but it's a good one. Um, Anyway, so I think that we have a 50% chance of reaching the Methuselarity within between, let's say, 12 to 15 years from now.
Okay. And that starts to be interesting, right? So let's say 12 to 15 years from now, and that means that some people have done some treatment on humans, perhaps you including, and those treatment can reverse and maintain, or sorry, I should say maintain and reverse the damage made at the molecular level from aging, so that people can just keep on being on the same treatment and do not necessarily age, roughly for the layman. Is that so?
Not exactly, but pretty close.
Okay.
The only real thing that you said wrong there is it's not the same treatment. So damage repair treatments, rejuvenation treatments, can be applied as often as you like, and they repair damage that has accumulated in the meantime. But the point about longevity escape velocity is that the same treatments are not enough, because each treatment will only fix a certain type of damage. And we have this very wide range of different types of damage that are accumulating. Some of them are harder to fix than others. So, because to some extent they are additive, that means that if we can only fix some of the types of damage initially, we will still buy ourselves time and increase our healthy lifespan, and that will let us develop the therapies that will fix more difficult damage.
Okay.
But again, not the same
Right.
type of damage. Right.
Interesting.
That's very important to understand, that the damage that is accumulating in the body is, by definition, the damage that we do not yet know how to fix. So we have to get better and better at that, because all of these types of damage accumulate, and if we just stop improving the therapies, completely stop, then eventually the stuff that we still don't know how to fix will catch up with us, and we'll get sick and we'll die anyway. So we have to keep on going.
Okay, so what kind of treatments are we looking at reasonably? Are these medicines or are these injections, or it is actually stupid to speculate about the form of treatment? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we talk about the form of the treatment,
Yeah.
there are really two ways to answer the question. One is, what is the form from the point of view of the people, the scientists who are developing the treatment? And the other alternative way of asking the question is, what is the form in terms of, from the point of view of the person who's getting the treatment? So the second one is easy to say. These treatments will not seem any different than treatments that we have today for infections or whatever.
Okay.
Sometimes you take a drug, orally. Sometimes it's an injection.
Okay.
Sometimes there might be surgery. You might have an organ transplant, for example. This range of options, this range of types of treatment that we have today, will continue to be true, but they will just be more powerful. So they may be, from the point of view of the people who are developing them, they'll be much more complicated. But that's kind of hidden from what the person who's getting the treatment sees. I like to use the example of the MMR vaccine, which is a vaccine that's been around a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone knows about it. It's just an injection. Fine. Thing is, it's not one vaccine; it's three vaccines for three different diseases: measles, mumps, and rubella. Right? And so you can totally imagine a single injection that would be for 300 things, but it would look just the
Okay.
same from the point of view of the person who's getting it.
Okay, and assuming that they would be successful and longevity escape velocity would allow you to keep treating new conditions and especially the most difficult conditions. What are those conditions that we would do away with? I imagine we would do away with all the typical diseases of aging, including Alzheimer, dementia, and stuff like that. Along those lines, am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, basically,
Okay.
it's actually a bit of a problem that
Hmm.
we give disease-like names to some, but not all, of the things that go wrong with us late in life. I think actually does more harm than good. It's confusing because, there's no difference between the aspects of age-related ill health that we call diseases and the ones that we don't call diseases. They're still bad for you. They still stop you from keeping up with your granddaughter on the dance floor,
So
right?
what are those that we don't call diseases? I'm getting curious.
So normally when we are talking here, we're talking about function, not about the molecular
Mm.
basis.
Okay.
So there's a word frailty. This word is used a lot by geriatricians. And, there are various definitions of frailty, but nobody really cares what the definition is because the point is the, the word is being used to express an opinion, namely
Okay.
that there are things that make you less functional that
Yeah.
don't count as age-related diseases. I think that's really damaging. I think that
Okay.
it's very much better to say everything that stops you from doing what you used to be able to do is a health problem, a medical problem that we need to fix, whether or not we call it a disease.
So conditions of several
Yeah.
kinds, including joint issues, are under the umbrella term of what you would say people call frailty.
Absolutely. And so
Okay.
when we come to what you were saying about the molecular level or the cellular
Yeah.
level, these are, of course, things that are happening in the body that cause the loss of function because, like any machine, right, the body is a machine, and so its function is determined by its structure, right?
Right.
And the structure in this case is the molecular and cellular structure.
Okay.
So absolutely, there are all these things that happen, and the big insight that I had back in the year 2000 was that we could actually classify these many, many different molecular and cellular changes in the body that eventually are bad for us. We could classify them into a relatively manageable number of categories, and that this classification was useful because it would also tell us how to go about repairing these various things.
Right.
That within each class, within each category, even if there are many examples within the category, nevertheless, there's one generic approach that addresses each of the various examples.
Okay. So I'm thinking about a lot of frailties that you mentioned. We tend to lose neurons as we age, right? And again, I apologize in advance for my very layman way to talk about these things. So we tend to lose neurons as we age. Would treatments under your umbrella term of longevity escape velocity address such an issue? Could we actually keep on functioning mentally? I'm just thinking about the dystopian scenario where just the brain doesn't want to work anymore because the synapses are just too difficult in a 400 years old's brain. I'm just speculating.
No, this is a very good question. For sure, there is no way that we would want to rejuvenate the body but not the brain. That would be
Right.
absurd, right? Luckily, however, the brain is made of more or less the same stuff as the
Okay.
rest of the body. The brain has different structure in detail, but at the end of the day, it really accumulates the same kind of damage. So a moment ago, you mentioned loss of cells dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this happens certainly in the brain, and there's very small number, if any, of areas of the brain that naturally fix that naturally
Yeah.
replace neurons that die. The simplest example of what to do about this is Parkinson's disease.
Mm.
And the reason Parkinson's is simple is because it's caused by the loss of a particular type of neuron that exists only in one very particular part of the brain. The type of neuron is called the dopaminergic neuron. The part of the brain is called the substantia nigra. Now, it
Okay.
turns out that these neurons die much more rapidly than other types of neuron in the brain. So that all of us, by old age, we've lost maybe a quarter of the dopaminergic neurons that we had in our early adulthood. Now, that's okay. It turns out that the system is set up to tolerate a quarter of a loss of that number of neurons, and nothing happens. But of course, aging is different for different people. Some
Yeah.
people get unlucky and they lose those neurons a little bit more rapidly, so that by old age they've lost maybe three-quarters of the neurons of
Yeah.
that type. And those people get Parkinson's disease because they're not making enough of this compound called dopamine that these neurons make. All right, so what do we do? We use stem cell therapy. We stick new neurons in. We don't exactly stick the neurons in, we stick in cells that are called neuronal
All
precursors.
right.
They know what to do, to divide and differentiate, to become replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. Okay, so that's the general principle, and it's not just a principle, it works. People
Mm.
have done it. In fact, 30 years ago, people tried this, and it was very hit and miss back then because we knew so little about how to identify the right neurons or whatever. But when it worked, so it hardly ever worked. Most of the time, it didn't work at all. But when it did work, it worked spectacularly well.
Okay.
So now we have so much more knowledge about how to manipulate neurons, or well, stem cells in general, in the laboratory before we inject them into anyone. So sure enough, people are doing that. There's a clinical trial underway right now in Japan to do exactly this, to replace the neurons in Parkinson's patients with ones that have been developed in the laboratory. And there are a couple of other trials starting out in the US as well. So that's just a simple example. But across the whole brain, of course, you've got the same kind of problem in various different ways. In late stage Alzheimer's disease, you have quite a lot of cell death. And, we'd like to fix all this. But the general principle is the same. We use stem cells to replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own.
I see. So I'm starting to understand why you say we need a lot of different treatments and they might as well be delivered in the same, the same injection. It has to be an injection or pill or whatever. I assume that a treatment that would target the loss of neurons would not necessarily target something else in the skin. So,
Right. Let me stop you there,
okay, sure.
Alex, because it's very important to understand what I meant there, and I may not have said it very well.
Okay.
The classification that I developed back in the year 2000, that is these seven different categories.
Right.
Let's say that this classification leads to the description of a generic therapy. I do not mean at all that we do one therapy to
Okay.
replace, all the cells that need replacing in different parts of the body. What I mean is that the different therapies that we'll need to do to repair different types of damage within a given category, those therapies will have a lot in common. So, for example, we may want to replace cells in the heart. Okay,
Right.
we will not do that by injecting anything into the brain. We have to inject things into the heart. But the question then is, what do we inject? Of course, we inject cells that are not the same as the ones that we would inject into the brain to address Parkinson's disease, for example. However, what they are is stem cells. They are cells that have the ability to divide, and some of the daughter cells will differentiate to become the cells that we need to replace, that are not being replaced automatically. Now, stem cells of different tissues have differences, but they also have a lot in common.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the way in which we create stem cells in the laboratory has, the way we create brain stem cells and heart stem cells and so on, has a lot in common. In other words, once we have the procedure in place, once we've figured out how to do stem cell therapy for one particular part of the body, like the brain, for example, then yes, we have to do some more work to
Mm-hmm.
develop stem cell therapy for another part of the body, but we don't have to start from scratch. We can reuse a lot of the knowledge that we gained in getting the first one working. That's really where this classification has its value.
Totally understand. So it's quite fascinating to think about what kind of wisdom we would have if we were to live such a long lifespan. Because I can think of how society would change dramatically. I don't know if you ever thought about whether it's useful to think about these kind of speculations. If we get to live for hundreds of years, the cost of a newborn would be something completely different from what it is right now. There will be a completely different understanding of life and death. What does it mean to die if you are 500 years old? It will be a completely different concept. It would be much worse than dying before, arguably. and much worse, a loss, right? So the idea of death and meditating about death would, if anything, be even more pronounced, right? Have you ever thought about the value system over death and how it could change?
Right. So I want to make a very sharp distinction here.
Okay.
The thing that you're talking about is not actually something that would happen to people who are much older than we are today. Because what you're talking about is not what it's like to be such and such an age. What
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about is what it's like to expect that one could potentially become such and such an age.
You think so?
So,
Okay.
and that's very, very important to recognize because we're only going to get older at 1 year per year, right? There
Yeah, it's
aren't
going
going
to
to
take
be,
hundreds of years before this occur.
we're not going to be, yeah, there's not going to be any 500-year-old people at all for at least 400 more years, right?
Right.
An awful lot of things that we can't predict happen
Yes.
in 400 years. But what you're really talking about is not that at all. What you're
Mm.
really talking about is how people would reevaluate their priorities, what they want to do, risks they want to take, if they think they could live
Oh, okay.
500 years, even if they're actually still only 50, right? And so that is really important to think about because it's going to happen very, very suddenly. There's going to be a point really, really soon, like before we get to longevity escape velocity, like maybe 5 years from now, there's going to be a point where most of society suddenly realizes, fucking hell, this is coming, right? And they're going to think it might well be in time for me. What the hell? I'm not going to want the same pension plan anymore. I'm not going to want the same life insurance or health. Yeah. Oh, and this is going to be very, very sudden. So I've been saying this for a long time, for the past decade at least. I've been giving talks to, pension funds and banks and life insurance agencies and so on. And the title of my talk is normally something like anticipate the anticipation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So you get what I mean, right? These people who are in the business of providing, services and products to people based on how long their customers think they're going to
Yeah.
live, right? They better be bloody ready to cope with massive change in how long people think they're going to live.
Yeah.
The anticipation of the anticipation that they need to anticipate is
Mm-hmm.
the anticipation of the arrival of these therapies. You get the idea.
Yeah, no, I think I now see your point. So I was actually referring to long-term events when people actually get 500 years old. But then when I hear you talking about this, it feels like the short-term anticipation is even more important. Because I mean, no matter what, when a major part of the society is centenarian, then of course the value system about death will change, right? Of course the expectations will change. Of course, arising a newborn will change, but that's something that will happen again, as you said, in hundreds of years. So what is concerning us much more is literally how the incentive schemes of insurance companies might actually be turned upside down in 2027, right? If this starts to grow up and take off really quickly, as many other phenomena are growing up so quickly. So in that short-term future, right, that's relatively a short-term future. So let's speculate it is possible that in a scenario where substantial advances in longevity science are made, and then the news is leaked out that actually this is something that can be scaled, right? I'm curious, what kind of conflicts do you see? Because something like that can break havocs all over the place, right? I'm sure there are going to be political activists saying, I don't believe this. This is all bogus. This is all another schema, conspiracy theory alike. So I can imagine a lot of conflicts. What kind of political and societal conflict do you think we should focus on in this short-term future where everybody anticipates to live more?
So the longevity revolution
Mm,
is very different from most technology-driven revolutions of the past in one very important way. Namely, people are already watching out for it.
mm-hmm,
Like when powered flight came along, Okay, it wasn't like that. What happened was we went from 0 to 1. We went from a point where it was generally believed that powered flight was impossible to suddenly there it was. You could, there were photographs. Right, right. It's not like that with longevity medicine. We're developing these things, and because it's such a complicated thing, we've got so many different parts of it to develop. We're getting partial results all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So people are watching this happening in front of their eyes, and especially because there's so much going on in the public sector, in the philanthropic sector, like my organization, for
Mm-hmm.
example, means that really I don't think we have to worry too much about what you said. I think that
Okay.
we are going to the main thing we have to be worried about is the way in which people are going to respond to the just to the expectation of what's going to happen. As these
Mm.
medicines become available, they'll just be medicines, right? And people are going to want them, same as they want any medicine. That's not going to be particularly unusual or particularly unprecedented. And in terms of the level of proof that they work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, I mean, that's again not something particularly new. In medicines that treat people who are already sick, we say, do they work? Does the person continue to exhibit the symptoms? Whereas with preventative medicine, applied to people who are not yet sick, all we've got is, are we kind of, postponing how soon they get sick? And so again, it's a little subtler, it's a little
Mm-hmm.
more conspicuous, but still, it becomes increasingly apparent that the medicines work. You
Yeah.
don't have to like wait for 100 years to see whether someone lives an unprecedentedly long time. You can just look at how healthy they are. Whether they are getting, even in a relatively small population, like for example the early adopters of a particular thing, or the people in a country that has a particularly liberal regulatory regime, for example. You know, the word is going to get out that way. It's not going to be the way that most technologies have been in the past.
So, okay, if I get to the bottom of this, it feels like, in your opinion, speculating about the manner in which the information will leak out is not necessarily something that we should pay a super big attention, because eventually will, the dust will settle.
I'm not quite that blasé about it.
All right,
No,
all right.
I do think it's very important that the information should get out. I wouldn't even
Okay.
say leak out. I would say it should get out. That all this should be done in the public eye as much as possible. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, my organization operates. Even the mouse experiments that we're doing, I'm putting out posts on social media every 2 weeks. You know how it's going, and that's going to carry on throughout the experiment.
Right.
And of course, when it comes to clinical data, same deal. Absolutely, these things have got to be out there. And this is the general attitude of the people in this community, the longevity community. There are plenty of activists, people who, and plenty of early adopters, people who want to self-experiment, if you like, to give themselves things that have not yet been shown, not gone through the regulatory process, but have, some kind of tentative evidence that they're valuable. And most of the people who want to do that, or at least plenty of them, want to share their experience. They want people to know whether this
Right.
is working, how well it's working, in what way it's working, and so on.
Sure. So this is something that would change a number of other things for the long run. So it was fascinating. I'm sure you've seen during the pandemic, a lot of public intellectuals were saying, yes, this event will change XYZ for a very long time. But eventually, if you actually look at pandemics, a lot of things tend to return to the original state after a couple of decades. So that was quite a false positive. Now, if we look at longevity, that actually is a true positive, because these things will gradually accumulate in a manner that will be a pervasive change in all aspects of society. So what I think would be super useful, and as I mentioned to you privately before this conversation, I haven't seen that yet, is people starting to write scenarios about longevity, futures of longevity. Because although as you said, it's very difficult to speculate on how these things will turn out, and it's probably not necessary to be correct, but at least laying out possible details about what disease will disappear, what new problems will pop up, how society will respond, what kind of value system change we will see. This, even if this is not going to eventually be how things will turn out, but at least we'll get people thinking. You know what I'm saying? And when I go to conferences, at least futures, foresight conferences, and I hear longevity people in Foresight talking about this, there are no scenarios. There's just very positive talk about how we will not die anymore and how immortality will be achieved. And it's just very difficult to, from a scientist perspective, right, to trust these talks.
Yeah, I sympathize with what you're saying. However, there is a big problem that is preventing this from happening. And that is that if we talk about scenarios for the even somewhat distant future, like 30 years from now,
Yeah.
right, we are required to make enormously many profound assumptions
Yeah.
about what's happening. And the thing is that the tendency, the enormously profound, ubiquitous tendency, is for people to make one assumption that's obviously wrong. Namely, that the thing that they're not really focusing on, all the things they're not focusing on, will stay more or less the same. So here's an example of what I mean here. That people say, oh, well, it's going to be very interesting in 50 years' time when we don't have aging anymore, and people are going to, and everyone's going to be nice and youthful and everything. How are we going to pay the pensions? They'll say, how are we going to actually, as if like automation just were not happening,
Everything else stays the same, basically.
Yeah, or they'll say, how will we cope with, climate when there's more people, as if like we won't have developed proper carbon capture. I mean, for crying out loud, it's just embarrassing. So, but of course, it also means that it's extraordinarily difficult. In fact, I would say virtually impossible to do this scenario planning because you have to do the scenario planning of all of these various profoundly transformative technologies in parallel, all together. Basically, this tells me, like, just give up. What we should do, what we should do is not try to scenario plan at all, but rather simply get better at responding to events as they happen.
Responding to events as they happen, so reactionary responsiveness.
At the societal level, be responsive, reaction driven. At the technological level, of course, we'd have to be pioneering. But the technologies can be developed relatively individually. It's just the societal consequences of the technologies that can only be thought about by combining this, and that is extraordinarily sensitive to the relative rates at which the different types of technology progress, which of course is completely unknowable.
Yes. Yeah. So let me provide a joint yet divergent viewpoint, which I think you might appreciate. So I agree with you that the overall and ultimate idea is to develop this sort of responsiveness, especially in view of the fact that according to what has been happening, it might happen. Longevity, escape velocity, and related stuff might happen quickly. So I'm 100% with you on that. Responsiveness, reactiveness, and all the abilities, organizational abilities that are making that happen, such as transparency. If you do not have transparency, you're not going to have reactiveness, right? You need to have a heuristic culture, prone to experimenting with new stuff, just like from day to night, right? So all these organizational capabilities should be fostered so that we can achieve this reactivity to longevity in the medical sector, for example, in academia, which is stuck in a very old incentive structure that probably is not reactive at all. So agree with you, but my divergent thinking compared to yours would be there are two kinds of scenario planning. One is lousy scenario planning, which is the kind you mentioned we should avoid, which is I tweak one variable and everything else stays the same. And I enjoy this weird dystopian science fiction sort of Orwellian future. Or good scenario planning is I start to look at all the signals of change, variables of change, and then I parallelly develop all of them. That's a lot of work, right? So that's good scenario planning. And in my experience, good scenario planning can foster those capabilities, right? Such as reactiveness and being prepared to possibilities. So I don't know if you can see that, right? So basically, I'm saying I'm agreeing with the objective, but I think the means can actually be doing good scenarios as long as they're good, just the qualification.
Yeah, yeah. I would have a hard time being convinced by that kind of thinking. Essentially, it comes down to the last thing I said before.
Mm,
The, that the big thing we don't know is the relative rates of progress in the various areas of technology.
mm,
For example, the scenario in which we achieve, pretty much complete elimination of work because of AGI
mm-hmm.
before we get to longevity escape velocity, that scenario is just completely different from the scenario in which those two things happen, but they happen in the other order.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, like so different that there's no way to compare them even.
Right.
And if you add in all the other things that we might need to develop, whether it's carbon capture, I can't see any way to construct a type of future and actually extract any kind of information from that construction that
Mm-hmm.
tells us what we should do now, to optimize our
Oh yeah,
future.
no, I don't even think that's the objective. Actually, I agree with you.
What is the objective then?
So I think the objective would be going back to what you said, develop a capability. So in other words, let's just say if you focus on a scenario and then you say this is going to happen, let's look at the probability. And if it's a high probability, then I might as well get prepared with these ABC contingency plans, right? I think that would be a wrong use of scenario. So another better use of scenario would be let's make it often, let's do it well, let's look at all the variables as you said, and the fact that you keep doing it and you look at different scenarios, you could look at the AI then longevity escape velocity scenario, or the longevity escape velocity then AI scenarios, and many others. That sort of practice, if you do it in the medical sector, for example, that would help a lot decision makers to start thinking about these issues, so they develop a more holistic view of, okay, we gotta start being prepared about being prepared. So it's a more like overall capability above and beyond, right? The contingency plan itself. I'm not sure if it makes sense.
Yeah, it slightly makes sense. Yeah, maybe. Um, I'm not convinced, but I mean, I don't think you're obviously wrong. Put it like that.
Okay, somewhere close. Anyway, let's get back to longevity itself. One last question before perhaps we talk about what we can do besides research, would be taking the postmodern view, right? So let's try to think about a future where something goes wrong. In your opinion, what is the major thing that could go wrong and we need to be aware of? So it could be something at a political level, it could be something at the research level, academia schemes, and so on. It could even be something about the topic you're doing research, about the molecular stuff you're tinkering with. What's the major risk?
I think there's a very broad tendency
Mm,
to worry too much about the potential things that could go wrong as a result of the development of such and such technology. I believe that it is possible for technologies to do harm, for pioneering technological progress to do harm,
mm-hmm,
but the only way it can happen is when three particular things are all true.
mm,
One is that the technology can do harm quickly,
mm-hmm,
and the other one is that it can do a lot of harm, and the third one is that a small number of people can make that happen. So
mm-hmm,
technology
mm-hmm.
is only
Okay.
bad, if a small number of people can do a lot of harm in a small amount of time.
Hmm.
If any one of those three is not true, you're safe.
Okay.
So if we look back at technologies of the past, there's really only one case where we kind of, we might have preferred that we hadn't invented it, and that is nuclear technology, which has, of course, resulted in nuclear weapons, which are quite dangerous, really. A small number of people can do a lot of harm with nuclear weapons in a short amount of time. But there's no way you can do harm in a short amount of time by fixing aging, right? Even
It doesn't happen in a short time. It's very simple.
now, if we look today, I mean, of course, it's very topical right now because just in the past few weeks, we've had the release of GPT-4 and a lot of work that's shown how big a step it is from GPT-3.
Yeah.
And various people have been worried about this. There's this open letter that was written signed by various people saying, we should have a bit of a moratorium on this, really.
Yeah.
And there are some people taking a much stronger position, saying, this is just like we need to shut the whole thing down forever, right? Whereas there are other people saying, it's all going to be all right. Honestly, I don't know. And I used to work in artificial intelligence before I was a biologist, and I don't know, right? So, that's pretty scary. But in my work in aging, there's just no way in the world that such a thing could apply.
I agree. I agree. Before this interview, I was trying to find a risk. I wanted to throw the risk at you and then see what you said. But all the risk that I found that people did raise about longevity, if you look closely, they're misguided, because I've heard a lot about the idea that this could be something only for the few and not for the masses. But then if you look at the laws of economy, it's just impossible that a country wouldn't want to sell this to everybody, in due time, right? Considering that in some months will take to scale these treatments, but still in the long-term future, this would not be a problem. If you look at the population concerns, right? We have too many people. Let's not add more people. But actually, a lot of models show that population is going down as country develop, right? So,
and let me interrupt for a moment and say,
please.
the thing that makes me most like just throw my hands up in despair is that a lot of people will actually raise both of those concerns that you just said.
Okay.
Like in consecutive breath. Yeah. Right. And I mean, how many fucking children can the world's billionaires have?
Exactly.
I mean, like, how hard is it to work that out? A 5-year-old could work that out, right? And yet, and this is what we have, right? We have people who, in every other walk of life, on every other topic, they're completely rational and intelligent and logical, and when it comes to aging, they just completely lose it.
Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to what you said before, that they have to find a way to rationalize the idea that we might as well die, because if rumors gets out that we might not die before several hundred years, then they will break havoc to their ordinary life.
That's right. Yeah, it's what I call the pro-aging trance. People have this compulsion, psychological compulsion, to put aging out of their minds by either convincing themselves that it's woven into the fabric of the universe and there's nothing we can do about it ever. It's just not it's off limits to medicine, or convincing themselves that it's some kind of blessing in disguise, that if we fix it, right, or both, of course, they're not mutually exclusive. And of course, this made perfect sense until I came along, until we had a plan. Yeah, right. Because until then, we had no idea how to go about doing anything about aging, even if we did agree that it was a medical problem. And therefore, there was no reason to come up with any time frame for how quickly we might achieve it. And therefore, the best thing was to carry on pretending that we'd never achieve it, so that we wouldn't be preoccupied by this terrible thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Car accident will still be there, even if your plan goes beautifully well, right?
Not for sure about that. If AI works out well.
Oh, yeah. Let's focus on longevity research. Longevity research will not do away with car accident alone.
But if other technology does away with accidents at the same time, of course, when I've talked about longevity escape velocity, I am being extremely conservative in what I say. It scares the living daylights out of everybody to talk about 1,000-year lifespans, but in fact, I'm being ridiculously over conservative because the only way that I'm saying that is by saying that we're going to get rid of aging. We're going to get rid of the increase in likelihood of death in the coming year, depending on how long ago you were born, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying anything about what happens to the risk of death from causes that do not have to do with how long
Yeah.
ago you were born,
Infectious
which,
diseases.
well, diseases, of course, actually do have to do with how long ago you were born because your immune system goes downhill.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. You see, this is me not being a medical scientist.
But there's plenty of things that you could argue that don't have to do with how long ago you were born, like
Okay.
car accidents or asteroids, and and that's going to go down as well. And so one can very easily do the arithmetic on this based on whatever assumptions one might want to make about how rapidly we will bear down on the risk of age-independent death. And even if you make insanely pessimistic assumptions about that, you basically end up with basically everyone who lives to 150 lives forever, right? So, and I don't even go there most of the time because I'm scaring people quite enough already.
I know. Okay, that's so interesting. Okay, let's not go there into the risk anymore. Let's close up with a more lighthearted question. What do you do, or what do you suggest to do to enhance our longevity besides research? I was looking at an interview you did with Joe Rogan, and it was funny to learn that you're not the person who does the most in this realm on Earth. Although somebody would think so, right? So it's interesting. I don't know if you changed since then. I think that was 2017. What do you now for longevity, if anything?
Well, I mean, so essentially my main thing is same as it ever was. Like I don't accept seminar invitations to dangerous countries.
That was not a response I expected.
You know, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's about, really. Avoiding the risk of death anytime soon, because as time goes on, one's risks of death, change. And so, in terms of postponing my own age-related decline, I'm still not quite 60. I'm almost 60, but not quite. I I'm doing very, very well for that kind of age. I get checked up in a very high end way often. Well, not often, but every couple of years, and everything's going nicely. Pretty much everything. So I pay attention to that kind of thing. But of course, because things are going well for me already, the rational approach is to be conservative, not to try to change things just because most people do things differently.
Right. So let's draw out some potential techniques, and I want to hear what you think. Your fellow researcher Dave Sinclair is all about diet, and there seems to be some evidence that plant-based diet reduces damage. I'm not sure if it's the molecular level or inflammation in the blood. I'm not such a scientist on that to say, but there is some evidence on that. But on the other hand, I also read some articles saying that vegetarian diets have the best outlook for longevity. So what is your take on diet? Do you have a take on diet?
I really don't. And the reason I don't is because it's pretty clear that it's extremely varied depending on from one person to the next.
Mm.
We all have different metabolisms. We all have different genetics and therefore different enzymes with different levels of activity. I mean, the same enzyme but with different levels of activity, and and these are in a network. So it's completely impossible to figure out some kind of real generalization that says this will be good for everybody. It's nonsense.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
The only way to really figure out how to live, in terms of diet and lifestyle and so on, is to pay close attention to your own body. That's the only generalization one can make. Do what works maybe experiment to some extent on, different diets, different lifestyles. Pay attention to what works.
Yeah.
If it works for you, carry on doing it. If it doesn't work for you, stop doing it.
So customize your diet so that it feels better, because you cannot really know whether it's good for your longevity. The only thing you know is whether it feels better, right?
But those things are very correlated. If something feels good, it probably is good.
That's good to hear. How about all the fad about fasting? It seems that the longer our lifespan, the longer the lifespan of an organism, the less effect fasting has on extra lifespan. Is that true?
Yes, it certainly is. So, honestly, this was very apparent 20, 25 years ago.
Hmm.
And when I came into the field in the late 90s and started to understand what was known and what was said about calorie restriction,
Hmm.
it was completely obvious already that shorter lived animals could benefit more from calorie restriction or from genetic or pharmacological emulation of calorie restriction
Okay.
than long-lived organisms. And yet nobody was saying it. In fact, people were actually sometimes just explicitly ignoring it and pretending that this wasn't the case. And I was outraged. I was really appalled. So I wrote a paper in, I'm going to say 2005, maybe '04, I forget now exactly, saying, we really just kind of can't sweep this under the carpet anymore. Nobody paid any attention. They carried on sweeping it under the carpet. But the fact is, it's completely clear that, yes, long-lived species get much less out of calorie restriction or drugs that emulate calorie restriction than short-lived species do.
This is such a pity because there's a huge fad now, especially in California where you live, on fasting.
Wait. The fact is, less is still not zero. Every month is worth having, right? So I'm not
Sure.
objecting to calorie restriction. I'm certainly not objecting to, calorie mimetics, NAD supplements, precursors, or, metformin or rapamycin. When you come down to the specifics of each individual one, there's always things to ask about, are there side effects, etc., because these things are always, approximations to the real calorie restriction thing. But yeah, I mean, if someone can get 6 months of additional healthy life out of calorie restriction and they don't have a particularly severe hit to their quality of life because some people find it a lot easier than others, right?
Right.
Then, more power. But it's important that people should not get an exaggerated idea of
Yeah.
the magnitude of the expected effect.
I agree. There is an opportunity cost. If you find it very difficult to fast, it's probably not worth to get those few months. Anyway, Aubrey, it was a pleasure. I tried to convince you about the effectiveness of scenario planning, but I'm not sure I completely hit the nail, but I still enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I sure did.
Where can people find you? Where are you most active? Actually, that's a better question.
Well, so of course, my organization, LEV Foundation, has a website,
Mhm.
levf.org. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes.
Yes, I will.
And I have an email address, aubrey@levf.org. I'm also easy to find on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook, and, well, especially Twitter. If you want to find me that way, yeah. So, but in general, yeah, I mean, that's the way to get hold of me and to find out what we're doing. We are continuing to, the foundation, the new foundation, LEV Foundation, is quite new. We only launched it in September, so 6 months ago.
Right.
And so there's still some work to do to actually professionalize its appearance. We don't even have a logo yet, things like that. But that's because we have prioritized getting shit done. So
Of course.
we started this extremely ambitious and audacious mouse lifespan experiment a couple of months ago, which I'm updating on social media every 2 weeks or so. And more updates on what we're doing will be available continuously.
Awesome. So, in case people want to give to Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, what are your words on that? Because I assume that not only big donors are useful, but small donors are also part of the story, right?
Oh yeah, every dollar counts. So of course, LEV Foundation, just like my previous foundation, Sense Research Foundation and Methuselah Foundation, we're a 501c3. That's a U.S. public charity. So anyone who pays U.S. taxes can get a tax write-off from donating to LEV Foundation. Obviously, we have a nice friendly donate button on our website. So that's very straightforward how to do it. You can do it in any way you like, whether it's fiat or crypto or stock or anything like that. Options are all there.
Great, great. So I'll try to put all the necessary links in the description box below. And how about you as a researcher? Is a book coming out anytime in the future? Is this something you have been thinking about? And another, major update on your research or something more broadly? I would love to see something on you addressing all the major risks and misconceptions about longevity in a written form.
Yeah, so my main book, Ending Aging, came out in 2007, which is more than 15 years ago now.
Right.
And the main reason I haven't updated it was because the essence of it has stood the test of time. Of course, progress and massive progress had occurred, but it hasn't changed really the way that I look at aging and the recommendations that I have for how to bring it under medical control. Now, Ending Aging was overwhelmingly a science book. There was only a little bit about, the issues of, whether this is a good idea and so on. And I was actually intending in probably 2010 or so to write a book addressing those questions. And then Sonia Arison did it for me. The book was called 100 Plus. It came out in 2011, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Sonia is a very well-respected commentator on tech matters, she's based here in the Bay Area, and she really, pivoted her focus into working on longevity. She subsequently created a venture fund called 100 Plus Capital, with the same title, basically. But yeah, so her book was very much focused on the why, why we should do this rather than how we're going to do it. And so that was the book that I would have had to write if she had not done it for me.
Understood. And I'll put that in the links as well.
Please do.
Thanks, Aubrey, for your time. Really appreciate it. Love your work. Please keep doing what you're doing, not only in the longevity sphere, but I think you are a great example as an innovator in general, as a radical who try to push the boundaries of research. Even if you're not in academia, it gives some sort of a push to the obsolete structure of research in academia. So I want to shout out that as well. So thanks for everything. Thanks again for this. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Bye for now.